back to another year of AIJAC Live Online. My name is Joel Burney, and it's fantastic to have you with us tonight for a very timely webinar that I'm sure many of you are interested in listening to. It's fantastic to have our streaming guests here with us tonight, as well as our international guests, and a reminder that you can catch up on all of AIJAC's content, both short and in long form, of all of our previous webinars on our YouTube channel. And if you'd like to share this webinar after the end, you can share it on our YouTube page or via Facebook as well to anyone that you might think will be interested in the content, which I'm sure there are many. As usual, ladies and gentlemen, halfway through tonight's webinar, we will be doing a Q&A session, so you can ask our guest any question that you have, and I'm sure there are going to be many of them. So without further ado, we'll get to our special guest tonight. And it's my pleasure to introduce back again to an AIJAC audience. Shmuel Rosner is a Tel Aviv-based think tank fellow and columnist and editor. He's a senior fellow at the Jewish People Policy Institute, as well as an analyst for Kan News TV. He is the founder and editor of the data journalism initiative, themaddad.com, and he writes a weekly column for the Jewish Journal in LA and for Maariv in Israel. Ladies and gentlemen, a timely topic, as I said before, this evening is Netanyahu's new government, its agenda and challenges. I would now like to hand over to AIJAC's Executive Director, Dr. Colin Rubenstein, to say a few words.
Thanks very much, Joel. Welcome everybody to our first webinar for 2023, and a particular welcome to our distinguished guest this evening, Shmuel Rosner. As Joel says, Shmuel, very experienced journalist and analyst, very well equipped to explain, analyze, evaluate the highly sort of controversial atmosphere, divisive, even bitter atmosphere that's developed in Israel since the November 1 election and the emergence of the Netanyahu-led government, probably the most right-wing government that we've seen in Israel's history, with the burning question on everybody's lips: will Netanyahu, who's probably the most pragmatic and centrist figure in that ministry, be able to contain, marginalize even the more hardline religious nationalist figures, ministers in government? So we saw the demonstrations on Saturday evening in Tel Aviv, 80,000 plus reportedly, and to a lesser extent, Jerusalem and Haifa. So there's no doubt that a variety of issues, including the alleged attack unbridled attack really on the legal system and on the checks and balances embedded in Israel's basic law, being on display. Talk of civil unrest, which one can't take lightly. And as I've said, the issue is to whether the Prime Minister can control those hardline ministers in his government. That's the question. Of course, the Prime Minister is saying, yes, broadly, vaguely, that he will preserve Israeli democracy and Israeli religious liberties, LGBT rights, of course, maintain ties to the US, which will be critical, of course, if he pursues effectively the main agenda, which is to deal with the threat, the existential threat of Iran, maintain the Abraham Accords and expand it. And indeed, we have seen, despite concerns in Arab allies, we've seen the Negev summit being concluded in recent days quite constructively to deal with resurgent Palestinian terrorism. The government is clearly getting tough with Palestinian terrorism, which we've seen resurge over the last year, 18 months, maintain good ties with world Jewry, and of course, maintain a degree of cohesion and consensus in Israel. Clearly, a lightning rod for the protest has been this question of judicial reform and judicial activism that goes back quite a while under Aaron Barak in particular. There's a very lively debate there as to whether it will weaken, undermine the Supreme Court checks and balances, or whether indeed some reforms are indeed warranted and overdue. There's resistance from powerful elites in Israel, we're seeing, including the security professionals, extremely important. So a lot of questions. I don't have the answers, but I'm hoping at least that our guest of honor tonight will certainly enlighten us in terms of being able to better handle and understand what's transpiring in Israel now. So Shmuel, over to you to address Netanyahu's new government, its agenda, and its many challenges. Shmuel.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm speaking this morning from Jerusalem, and actually later this afternoon I'm going to have a few meetings. First meetings with new ministers in the government who called me in for some interviews. So this is a time in which everybody prepares for what a new government intends to do in the coming 3 or 4 years, if it has such a long term in office is still an open question. But let me begin by just setting the stage and making sure we're all agree on some simple facts. First one, and this is good news, after 5 consecutive elections, Israel does have a functioning majority coalition of 63, 64 members with which it can operate, pass legislation, implement policies, and bring some stability to Israel's chaotic political system of the last 5 years. I think that even Israelis who did not vote for this government or who disapprove of its intentions should recognize the fact that stability is crucial for any democracy, and that having a functioning government is important for the future of Israel. And we do have what seems like a coherent and a functioning government that came into office. This government is coherent in the sense that is quite troubling to many Israelis. It is definitely the most right-wing religious government ever assembled in Israel. That's a result of many reasons, some of which are demographic reasons, the changes in the nature of Israel's population, but it is also a coincidence based on certain facts that happened in Israel's political system. Some factions that could not pass the electoral threshold, some parties that disintegrated during the 4 years of elections. So ultimately, we find ourselves with a coalition of which about half are Likud members, right-wing, the main right-wing political party of Israel, and the other 3 members of the coalition are highly religious parties. We have the 2 ultra-Orthodox parties, Yahadut HaTorah and Shas, but the third party, Tzionut Hadatit, the standard Zionist religious party that is usually a member of right-wing governments, is today much more conservative, much more religious than its previous incarnations. The current way this party was assembled, established, and formed makes it much more right-wing and much more religious than previous Zionist religious parties. So this also impacts the current coalition, of which you can say about half are secular or traditional members of Knesset, and the other half are very to ultra-religious, which again impacts the character of the coalition. Now, the challenges for this government are many, and when we look at challenges, we have to remember that each government, there are always things that the government must deal with, namely crises that come its way and the government cannot ignore. So if there's inflation in Israel, as there is in the rest of the world, then the government must deal with inflation and with economic challenges, and it has no choice but to find pragmatic solutions for economic challenges. The issue of Iran is front and center. It was when Prime Minister Netanyahu introduced his government, even though in the last 2-3 weeks, all we talk about is the reforms of the legal system and state and religion affairs, etc. When the prime minister introduced his government, he spoke about 3 things: Iran, peace with Arab neighbors, namely advancing and expanding the Abraham Accords, and economic expansion and reforms. So for Prime Minister Netanyahu, the main goals are in the geopolitical arena and the economic arena. However, other members of his coalition have other things on their minds. And since this coalition is stable and yet quite narrow, the prime minister must address or must let some of his partners achieve their own goals. What are these goals? I would speak about 2 main things. The first of which is reforming the legal system. It's not just about the Supreme Court. It's the legal advisors to the government and to government ministries. It's the Supreme Court. It's the way Supreme Court justices are elected. The basic idea is to weaken the strength of the legal system and strengthen the ability of politicians to enact their policies without having legal advisors or justices interfering with these policies. Basically, the argument, I'm trying to be as fair as possible and as balanced as possible here. The argument of the coalition, and there is some truth to this argument, is that during the 90s, some 30 years ago, the Supreme Court altered the balance between the legal system and the political system, gave too much power to the lawyers and to the justices, took away power from the parliament and the government, and the reform that is initiated now is aimed at restoring that ancient balance in which the people are the sovereign and the legal system is just an advisor or a guardian of the laws enacted by the parliament, but is not able to legislate from the bench as the politicians argue. So this is the overall concept of trying to reform the legal system. And in Israel, you basically have 3 approaches to this proposed reform. One is the way the coalition sees it. It's necessary, almost urgent. It will make Israel stronger. It will make the people more influential. It will enable the government to enact its policies, and it will not damage Israel's character as a thriving democracy. That's the nature of the argument made by the coalition. In the opposition, you have 2 main streams. One that opposes any change to the legal system and argues that any attempt to alter legal precedent or to weaken the court or the legal system will damage Israel's nature as a democracy. There is a middle stream or a middle ground of people who argue that they accept the need for some change. However, they believe that the government is overreaching, that in an attempt to correct a mistake, they are correcting one mistake by making another mistake, that the pendulum should not go as far in the other direction, and maybe a possible compromise can be found. Currently, I'm not quite optimistic that the 2 sides can come together to negotiate the terms of such compromise. The president of Israel, Yitzhak Herzog, is trying to quietly speak with people behind the closed doors and see if there is a chance for finding compromise, then again, the coalition is in somewhat triumphant mood, and it doesn't feel the need to compromise with anyone because it has the majority. And on the other hand, there are many radicals on the other side who would not agree to compromise. So it's not clear if such thing can actually materialize. That's the issue of the legal system. The issue of state and religion affairs. Again, this government consists of at least half the members of this coalition are highly conservative and very religious. And again, their narrative, the narrative that they tell themselves and other Israelis, is that in the last couple of decades, Israel was in some ways secularized. Many of the laws that were enacted to, for example, to make sure that the Shabbat is observed in the public sphere and other issues were not diligently enforced by the government. There are many issues in which Israel became less conservative, has less of a Jewish flavor to it, a weaker Jewish identity and other such arguments. And these members of the coalition would like to initiate and enact some measures or some legislation that will, in their view, strengthen Israel's Jewish identity. These issues concern the curriculum in different schools, you know, the number of hours and the type of teachers and material that will be provided to school children. They would like to weaken the influence of what they see as the radical progressive movements, to weaken the influence of LGBTQ advocates in Israel, to weaken the ability of post-Zionist or anti-Zionist activists and NGOs to have their agenda influencing Israeli culture or education and all kinds of other things. This is, of course, worrying for many Israelis who are on the other side of this divide or this debate. And we should expect, and this is natural to expect, that the coming years will be years of battle between these two camps. The government will try to enact some measures. The other side is going to oppose these measures. Some of them will come to pass and some of them will not. I don't think this will be dramatically different than what we've seen in previous governments, but we do have to take into account the fact that many religious members of the coalition are highly ambitious, and that this coalition is indeed more religious than previous coalitions. So on some issues, namely kashrut, conversion, certainly the debate over the Western Wall representation of the progressive movements, etc. All these issues will tilt the way of the more conservative wing of the coalition, because this is their agenda, this is what they promised their voters, and that's the condition for their participation in the current Israeli coalition. I suggest that I'll stop here. There's plenty more to say, but I think we gave an overview of the main issues, and maybe having a lively conversation will be better for all of us. So please.
Thank you for that, Shmuel. Ladies and gentlemen, you'll see at the bottom of your Zoom screen a reactions tab. You can hit that button, and then there's a raise hand feature that will provide me with a silent notification of your intent to ask a question. And as many hands up as possible would be great. And I will hand over, as usual, for our first question to AIJAC's Dr. Zvi Fleischer.
Hi, Shmuel. Thanks for that. Good to see you, and a wonderful presentation. One of the on the issue you were just talking about of religious issues. One of the issues that I think a lot of diaspora communities are concerned about are changes to the law of return, particularly a change that would exclude people with one Jewish grandparent from being eligible for immigration under the law of return. Could you explain to us a bit about what is the logic for doing that for the government's point of view? Do you think it will get up? And if it does, how much of an effect will it have on Aliyah from diaspora communities?
Well, it's a great question, and ultimately I can't tell you if this will come to pass. The government speaks in two contradicting voices on this issue. On the one hand, you see government officials, including ministers, highly committed to altering the law of return. On the other hand, we have Prime Minister Netanyahu on tape promising that the law of return will not be changed during this term. So it is still too early to know whether this change come to pass. But trying to understand the logic behind this demand is not quite difficult. When we look at Aliyah to Israel in the recent decades, we see that from year to year, the share of people who immigrate to Israel under the law of return and become citizens and who are Jewish, either halachically or even identify as Jewish, this share is going down. Namely, more and more people who come to Israel under the law of return aren't Jewish or aren't necessarily Jewish. There are indeed the grandchildren of Jews, in many cases the grandchildren of one Jewish grandmother or grandfather, either on their mother's or father's side. Some of them do say that they feel Jewish or connected to Judaism in some way, but many of them would readily admit that they aren't Jewish. The law of return, the logic behind the law of return was to make Israel a place of refuge for all Jews, not for all people. And if the law of return becomes a way for people who clearly aren't Jewish to immigrate to Israel, then at least for some Israelis, this means that the law of return no longer fits the aim for which it was established, and hence they would like to, again, not to cancel the law of return, but to change the parameters that under which people can come to Israel. Putting it simplistically, they would like to cancel the grandparent clause and make it a parent. You know, you have to have a Jewish parent, not a Jewish grandparent, to come to Israel. This will, of course, raise many questions concerning Jewish communities around the world, in which the share of people who only have Jewish grandparent is rising. So we see trends here that are somewhat contradicting. On the one hand, a trend in the diaspora Jewish world in which more Jews or more people can only come forward with a Jewish grandparent and not necessarily a Jewish parent. On the other hand, in Israel, we see an immigration policy that no longer fits at least the original purpose of the law of return. And hence we see this debate, and it is a debate both within Israel and outside of Israel. I would urge, I have a meeting today with the Minister of Absorption Again, later today, that's one of the ministers I'm meeting. So my proposition to him would be not to make such change without broad and patient consultation with the broader Jewish world. I don't think we are in a situation that is urgent in any way. I don't think there is an urgent need to make a change in the coming 2 or 3 or 5 months. There is time to have consultation and try to find common ground between all Jews. But ultimately, when Israel needs to decide what its immigration policies for the coming years is going to be, the law of return is certainly on the table, and we will, whether this government is going to change it or not, the law of return is on the agenda, and such discussion is going to take place in the coming years.
Thank you, Shmuel. I'll now hand over to Jamie Hymes for the next question.
Thank you, Shmuel. Thanks, Joel. There's always an ongoing debate in diaspora communities like ours about to what extent the Jewish community here and Jewish leadership should be criticizing or expressing concerns about what's going on in Israel. And this is obviously ramped up a bit with concerns about the nature of the new government. So I was wondering, in your view as an Israeli, what do you think, to what extent do you think it's appropriate for diaspora communities and the Jewish leadership of those communities to be criticizing or expressing concerns about the actions or government of Israel? Thanks.
Well, my answer to this question is my advice to everybody is to be pragmatic. If you think that you have the ability to somehow convince Israelis of something, influence Israeli policymakers, alter Israel's policies in a certain way that you think are better for Israel or for world Jewry, then by all means, I invite you to participate in the debate. In my experience, and based on many surveys that I conduct in Israel, most attempts by world Jewry to influence Israeli policies change very little in actual policies, and in some cases are even damaging to the causes of world Jewry. So whether people have the right to participate in the debate, of course, everybody has the right to have their own opinion. I would propose for that world Jews. It's better for world Jews not to criticize Israel more than they praise Israel, not to be seen as more critical than loving, because if Israelis begin to see world Jewry as an obstacle rather than an ally, that's a problem. And on all other things, I just try to be pragmatic. In some cases, you can participate in this debate and maybe have some positive impact. In many cases, participation is no more than airing of frustrations. And in such cases, I would advise against it, even though it is frustrating to remain silent when you see things that you dislike going on in Israel. So I'm not sure if it's very helpful, but that's my advice.
Thanks, Shmuel. I'll now hand over to Walt Secord for the next question. Thanks, Walt.
Thank you. Shmuel, in your opening remarks, you referred to, quote, the next 3 to 4 years of the government. So you think this government will hold together for a full term? And that said, how does that play out in relation to world leaders dealing with the government and diaspora Jewry?
So whether the government survives or not, it's really, in Israel, making such bet is always a huge risk. I'll tell you it's going to survive, then in 2 months it will collapse, and you'll come back and say this person is not a serious analyst. This government has the potential to survive, if not the full term, then at least for the foreseeable future. It has the potential because it's small enough to be coherent. It is determined enough to have the ability to control its more radical elements, and it is. I think it has a leader wise enough to know that any new election would be a huge bet for him and for the members of his coalition. And with the opposition, when you see an opposition in a highly vindictive mood, you do not want to risk it. Both Likud and the ultra-Orthodox parties know that if they go to a new election and there's a new government of the center-left will be as radical in its quest to crush the reforms of the current coalition as they are now determined to crush the reforms of the previous government. So I think there is high motivation for this government to survive. For world leaders, this means that they have to look at this government seriously and to understand that this is the government that Israel is elected, like it or not. This is the government that is going to control Israel's policies and actions in the coming years, which means that if you are an Iranian, you have to look at this government and ask yourself whether it is serious about its ability to prevent them from acquiring nuclear weapons. If you're Saudi Arabia, you have to look at this government and ask yourself whether you want to wait for another government before you move forward with normalization processes. And if you are the US government, you have to ask yourself whether you want to pick a fight with an Israeli government for the next 3 or 4 years, or find ways for cooperation. So for everybody, again, my advice would be to treat this government seriously. It's not unlike the previous government. The previous government was innovative in many ways and refreshing in many ways, but we knew right at the beginning that its ability, that it will be tricky for such government to survive and thrive for very long. It was a government of a community of rivals, and it was clear from the outset that for Bennett and Lapid and Lieberman and all the others to stick together for very long is going to be very tricky. This is not the case with the current government. The current government is a natural, cohesive government, and you can foresee a future in which it survives for quite a long time.
Thank you for that insight, Shmuel. I'll now hand over to Aaron Shapiro. Aaron, you there?
Yes, hi, Shmuel. I had a question about something we've been dancing around quite a bit. The Religious Zionism Party and the coalition it made with the Otzma Yehudit, with Itamar Ben-Gvir. And a lot of people, first of all, found it very surprising that in the diaspora, found it surprising that Ben-Gvir did so well. To what extent did the clashes between Jews and Arabs openly during the last Gaza escalation play a role in Ben Gvir's rise, and what potential do you see? There's been a lot of rhetoric about his potential for coming to terms with the reality of government after being a flamethrower in opposition. So to what extent do you think he can reform himself and should be taken seriously?
So these are both great questions. For the first of which I have a simple and blunt answer. If you want to blame anyone for Ben Gvir's rise, blame Arab Israelis. It's fairly clear that the riots 2 years ago were the reason for Ben Gvir's rise. We can detect in different polls, including one that was published just yesterday, that many Israelis feel that the level of internal security in Israel is declining. They feel insecure. They felt that the riots of Arab Israelis in cities inside Israel, in mixed cities such as Lod and Akko, posed a great danger to Israelis, and also reminded Israelis that the issue of that many Arab Israelis did not yet come to terms with the fact that Israel is a Jewish majority, Jewish and democratic state. And hence many Israelis, especially in the periphery, in the Negev and in the Galilee, including Israelis who previously voted for centrist and even left-wing parties, decided to send a message by electing someone like Ben Gvir, basically sending the message that internal riots and internal criminality and violence will not be tolerated. Now, whether Ben Gvir can move from a position of being a renegade, sometimes even a criminal, to becoming a disciplined and well-managed politician, that's for him to prove. We know from previous experiences that some people can make such transitions. There were people in Israel's past that were renegades and then became responsible, well-managed, disciplined, professional leaders. Other such people were not able to make the transition, and they were cast aside pretty quickly. So it's up to Ben Gvir now to decide whether he becomes a pragmatic and efficient politician. He made some real promises to his constituency. He must now show Israelis that he can actually make good of his promises. If he restores law and order in the southern part of Israel, in the Negev, he might get even more votes in the next election. If he fails to do such thing, this can be a one-time episode, and in the next election, we might see him going back to being a marginal person on Israel's periphery.
Thank you, Shmuel. I'll now hand over to Justin Amler for another question.
Hi, Shmuel. With the current war going on in the Ukraine, and obviously Israel doing this very difficult balancing act between Russia and Ukraine, do you think there will be any change in the new government's policy regarding Russia and the war in Ukraine?
right now I see no such tendency for change. And I must tell you that, again, we conducted a public opinion poll on this issue in Israel just 3 weeks ago. And the Israeli public supports the current policy of the government, which is basically the same policy of the previous government. You know, there are some nuances there, but by and large, Israel decided right at the beginning of the war that it does not want to take a very clear side. It does not want to ruin its relations with Russia and clearly be on the side of the, you know, of Ukraine, on the right side of history, so to speak. I think all Israelis understand that Russia is the aggressor. All Israelis understand that Ukraine is the more righteous part to this conflict. There's no moral issue. It's not as if Israelis are confused concerning the morality of the situation. Israelis are just being pragmatic. Their argument would be, you know, this is a world conflict. This is up to the superpowers to decide. Israel has no role, no real role in this conflict, and no real dog in this fight. And hence, for Israel, for various geopolitical reasons, it is important not to hurt itself and risk its own interests, just to be seen as more, you know, to get some appraisal or some, you know, to avoid condemnation. Israel has real security interests in Syria. Its relations with Russia are important. And I think that currently the government is not entertaining any thoughts about risking these relations. Again, there can be change under, you know, if there's huge political pressure from the United States, maybe a proposal that Israel will get something in return for changing in position on some issues. But I think Israel's tendency to just keep going in the same direction on this issue.
Thank you, Shmuel. I'll now hand over to Brian Wiener for the next question. Can you put your camera on there, Brian?
There we go. Yeah, hello, Shmuel. I just want to ask you, I've noticed recently in the last few days, a very worrying trend in Israel. You know, we always say that the Arabs say one thing in Arabic, another thing in Hebrew, and one thing in Arabic, another thing in English. And I find now these protests, what do they call them, demonstrations, protests, like the big one in Tel Aviv the other night, against the government. And I've heard so many Israelis leading. I think Esther Chayut, the president of the Supreme Court. I heard today, forgotten his name, the fellow he was the deputy Ramatkal. He was the Meretz guy. A lot of other people, very senior people, are saying, they're asked a question, but what's your problem? The coalition won, and they say, yes, they won democratically, but democracy doesn't mean anything. This is the will of the people. Forget democracy. Just because they won, it means nothing. And I've heard this from many, many people. And to me, this is the beginning of anarchy. And I find it a very worrying trend. Just wondering if you have any comment on that.
Well, again, it is a comment that you do hear from some people, not from the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. She was much more nuanced in her comments. Look, this is what happens when one side is seen as if it is trying to change the rules of the democratic game, altering the power of the Supreme Court to strike down laws, or altering or changing the ability of legal advisors to tell the government what's legal and what's not legal. Again, the coalition would call it more democracy, namely more power to the representatives of the people. And the other side calls it, an authoritarian majority, a majority that will have no boundaries or no restrictions on power. So again, what we see here is a tension, and you see such tension in all countries between wanting to implement the will of the people and not having the people getting the ability to repress or somehow damage the rights of the minority. How do you give the majority its power to rule without making life of the minority impossible to sustain? This is the debate we're having. And again, it's a fierce debate because this is not a debate about certain policy. It's not about, whether we should raise taxes in 5% or 10%. It's a debate about the rules of the game. And the rules of the game in a divided society, that's the most crucial issue. And that's why you see such high emotion on both sides. On the coalition side, when they say, well, you don't let us rule this country. We got the majority, we won the election, but the legal advisors still tell us what to do. And on the opposition side, you say, okay, this is a coalition or a majority run amok. They no longer consider the law as something that they must obey. Again, this tension is going to continue, and that's why you hear a rhetoric that is somewhat radical on both sides. And rhetoric, when you get radical rhetoric, it's not healthy for any society, certainly not for the current Israeli society.
Thank you, Shmuel. Sometimes I use my prerogative powers and ask a question from the moderating post. I'm going to do so. So we've covered quite a bit in tonight's webinar, and I thank you for that. We've discussed judicial reform. We've discussed certain elements of the governing coalition and the reasons for and against. We haven't even got to more broader geopolitical issues, such as how this new government's going to handle the Iran issue, the pursuit of expanding Abraham Accords and what that means for the region. And we haven't even discussed the Palestinians. But the one question that I want to ask Shmuel is, how does Netanyahu become a moderating force for his own government? Meaning, conventional wisdom would state that if anyone can do it, it's him. How do you see Netanyahu dealing with his own government to, as you suggest, and I think correctly, that he would like to see it last for as long as possible? How does he do it?
Well, first of all, we must know that for Netanyahu, the current government, he finds himself in an awkward position with this government. Previously, Netanyahu always made sure not to be at the far side, right or left of his own coalition. He always made sure to be at the center of his coalition, to have some partners who are more to the right and some partners more to the left than himself. And then he could become the moderating power by engaging the two sides of his own coalition. The current coalition is different in the sense that Netanyahu is indeed, that's quite funny to say, but that's the way it is. He is the most left-wing member of his own coalition. And this will be difficult for him. He will have to make some compromises that he didn't have to do in previous coalitions. What he does have is the acknowledgement of all members of the coalition that they have no better alternative. They got their dream coalition. They kept saying before election day that they wanted, once and for all to have they call it Yamin Male Male, like a full right-wing coalition. They got what they wanted. I'm not sure Netanyahu wanted it to be in such way, but this is what they got. And this very right-wing coalition, if it doesn't survive, this will be proof that such governments are not able to govern Israel. This will not send a great message to Israeli voters for the next round. If you cannot rule Israel with a highly right-wing coalition, maybe we must elect someone else. However, if they can prove that even a very right-wing, very religious coalition can sustain its rule, can be coherent, can be pragmatic when it's necessary, govern Israel without leading to catastrophe, in such case, they will have a good platform with which to come to the voters in the next round and say, you see, they warned you that such government is going to lead to all kinds of gloom and doom, but Israel is thriving. Maybe you ought to give us another chance. So that's the power Netanyahu has. He can speak with the other leaders of his coalition and say, we must prove to the voters that such coalitions can govern Israel. Otherwise, we prove them right and we prove ourselves wrong. And this, he hopes that this will be a restraining enough force for them to come to terms with reality. All governments come with an agenda and then must face reality. In reality, no government can fulfill its full agenda. This government will be no different.
Thank you for that, Shmuel. I'll now hand over to Colin to ask a few questions.
Thanks, Joel. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, great. Time's running out, so I'll ask a triple header probably. A word on Netanyahu's corruption trial, potential time bomb. What impact may that have on the longevity and even the credibility of his government? Secondly, Netanyahu would clearly like to strengthen and expand the Abraham Accords. What are his chances? And the third aspect of that is the Palestinian issue. How will he handle the issue of expanding settlements, etc., and keeping open, even at the end of days, the possibility of some sort of two-state outcome or something way down the track, of course, in contrast to some of the hopes and expectations of his coalition partners?
So first question, Netanyahu's trial is probably going to take years before it ends. There's the current trial, then there is an appeal, and another appeal, and a counter appeal. And before it ends, he can be prime minister for a very long time. Some people tend to speculate that at some point when it nears an end or under an initial verdict, maybe a plea bargain can be achieved, and then Netanyahu will retire in exchange for dropping the charges or the cases or whatever. But this is not something that's coming just around the corner. It will take very long time. So for now, it's not a huge issue for the coalition. It's an obstacle. It's more noise. This system is a very noisy system, and this adds more noise to what we currently have. But it's not an obstacle that the government cannot overcome. The Abraham Accords. Look, that's the great ambition of Netanyahu. Netanyahu would like to add Saudi Arabia to the list of countries who normalized relations with Israel. Is this going to happen or not? Depends mostly on the considerations of the Saudis. It will depend on developments concerning Iran, what happens in between Russia and Ukraine, changes in the United States, all kinds of different considerations. If the Saudis feel ready or feel that it's necessary to ally with Israel, to have a stronger bond with Israel, they might decide to go in that direction. If not, then we'll have to wait. The Palestinian issue is currently on the back burner. However, and this is something that again can be a dramatic game changer, there are warnings from all chiefs of all security forces in Israel that the situation, especially in the West Bank, in Judea and Samaria, is volatile. They warn that even small things could lead a large fire in the territories and even lead to a so-called third intifada. Naturally, if such thing happens, this changes the situation in all kinds of ways. If Israeli sees it as the fault of the current government, if they think that the government misbehaved or provoked the Palestinians in some unnecessary way, this will weaken the ability of the government to function. If Israelis rally behind the government because they think that the Palestinians had began a cycle of violence without good reason, then this could strengthen the government or even convince some other parties to join the government for having to deal with that situation. So what happens with the Palestinians? The basic thing is that we are currently waiting for the Palestinians to have a new leadership. The current leadership, Mahmoud Abbas, is a very old man, and clearly everything is geared up towards succession battle between Palestinian factions, and until this happens and resolve itself, I don't see much progress to expect on the Palestinian front. On the other hand, violence is always, when there's violence, you must expect changes, and this could be something that the new Israeli government must deal with and must consider a priority, even though the Palestinian issue for now is hardly a priority for this coalition.
Thank you, Shmuel. We are coming up to the hour, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for staying with us. I'll now hand over to Jeremy Jones for the final word.
I just very much like to thank you, Shmuel. We are obviously very interested in what's going on. We hear a lot of noise, but we don't hear very much information, and certainly not such clear analysis as you were able to provide us with during this session. We know that this is a time when you are in a great deal of demand because of your expertise and knowledge, and we at AIJAC are grateful that once again you've allowed us to be the beneficiaries of your insights. You've given us a lot to think about, and we will have more questions for you, and we look forward to our next opportunity to discuss Israel and the bigger issues relating to the Jewish world with you in the near future. Thank you very much, Shmuel.
It was a pleasure. Thank you, everybody.
So to echo Jeremy's thanks there, thank you on behalf of AIJAC, Shmuel, for a wonderful webinar. Ladies and gentlemen, we're far better off after that, listening to the past 60 minutes. There's a lot of burning issues there. Please keep a lookout on AIJAC social media pages as well as your email inboxes for more and more information coming out of AIJAC. As I said, this webinar and all of our other webinars are on our YouTube page and also on our Facebook page, and you can send them to your friends widely if you think that they would enjoy it. Thank you again, Shmuel. On behalf of the AIJAC team, ladies and gentlemen, until next time, have a lovely night, and we'll see you next time.